Welcome to Innovation Leadership. I'm Jess Larson. On this episode, we get to have Noel Thomas, CEO of Darkwatch, out there countering human trafficking. And what I'm super excited about is turning it into a tech play and getting backing from some great financial sources, including pro athlete Tim Tebow. And I got to give a quick shout out to my cousin Chrissy Robertson, who got us together here. Works with Darkwatch. Noel, I loved our last conversation. I want to get into the history, but let's start with what is Darkwatch and why are so many big companies becoming your client?
Absolutely. So Darkwatch is a technology and artificial intelligence that helps companies and governments identify the sophisticated human trafficking networks. And the reason that they're starting to purchase this technology is that there's been lawsuits with JP Morgan and Red Roof Inn and all of these lawsuits for human trafficking and improper controls to stop human trafficking. So we happen to be at the right place at the right time with this technology and excited to bring this to market.
Yeah. Obviously this is from a nonprofit perspective. Our listeners have heard a lot about this from me. We've been running our Child Rescue Association, combating this for the last 15 years. But some of my favorite folks to meet in this same fight are the ones who are pulling on the purse strings. We had Lisette Cooper on. She's from a very large private wealth management firm that she built. And they would do things like get proxy votes and so get shareholders involved. And they got Verizon to put in new controls so that child sexual abuse imagery, people call child porn, wasn't getting shared on Verizon networks, and going after tech companies that way. These lawsuits are a big wake-up call for folks who, just would rather kind of put their head in the sand. Can you talk about the numbers of how big some of these lawsuits have been?
Absolutely. So the JP Morgan lawsuit was $290 million. There was a days in payout of $21 million. And several that were undisclosed amounts in the Red Roof Inn case. We know that Meta, Salesforce, and several other companies, including Abercrombie and Fitch, are all under sex trafficking lawsuits. And I think that there's several industries that are primed for this. That's social media, hospitality, agriculture, and financial institutions.
Yeah. So JP Morgan and Jeffrey Epstein was obviously in the news a lot. For people who didn't hear about Red Roof Inn, can you give a couple details?
Yeah, absolutely. So the hotels didn't think that they would be liable for sex trafficking. And when it went to court, they started looking at things like the online reviews. And in the case of Red Roof Inn, there was online reviews where people were saying, sex trafficking is occurring at this Red Roof Inn branch. Someone needs to do something about it. And so those reviews played a big part of the gross negligence for Red Roof Inn. And these hotels are finding themselves liable. I went out on a raid when I was working on the government side in a motel, and the front desk staff had actually tipped off the trafficker that a raid was going down. So in that case, the motel was directly facilitating sex trafficking. So it can range from very gross negligence or just improper controls or response to the issue.
Yeah. So tell us about supply chain and why this is becoming so important to corporations.
Absolutely. So with these modern slavery acts in the UK, they require that supply chains start doing due diligence on their suppliers. And it could be everything from textiles to other based products. And we're starting to see that legislation and regulation come into the US. Canada has passed laws about supply chain transparency. And we're only going to see more of that because a lot of companies, either knowingly or unknowingly, are using supply chain vendors that are engaged in slave labor. And you're starting to get more consumers that are pushing back and asking for more ethically sourced products. And so I think that to quell the labor trafficking side of this, we're going to see more corporations respond as regulation and litigation starts to come down.
I don't know if I share or not publicly, but I saw some pretty cool stuff on the computer screen when we were talking. Um, how much of your system and how it helps identify organized crime at for both for counterterrorism, counterintelligence, organized crime reasons around say military bases and stuff? How much of that do you disclose?
Yeah, so we talk about this, that there's several ways in which criminal organizations can use sex trafficking as a way to gain intelligence. And when you start to pull the data and the threads, you see this close proximity to sex trafficking networks, to sensitive sites, if you will. And so I think that this is only an emerging trend that has to be taken very seriously, because it's one of the gaps that isn't often looked at.
Yeah. So on the business side, again, organizations that always thought that's not my problem, we're not engaging in it, so we don't have any obligation to society to help prevent it, are getting a big wake up call to the tones of, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. On the government side, you look at like, I don't know, the kind of like look the other way about like Marines or sailors when they're in ports and going to have a good time at the bars and with girls. And now you're seeing, obviously, cases of charges of human trafficking against military members, investigations, Secret Service, some of these folks, and like the reputational liability and all these things are changing attitudes amongst the leaders of our servicemen. And then certainly the counterintelligence opportunity of, a foreign government who can get someone in authority or someone with access to American secrets to engage in that and videotape them and blackmail them and things like this. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. So, you mentioned the counterintelligence risk and blackmail. I mean, it's one of the classic tricks of adversaries to use sexpionage as a way to ensnare for blackmail and extortion. The other thing to consider is that there's a huge reputational risk to these corporations and government agencies, and we're starting to see the societal reckoning of where we have looked the other way for so long and just said, hey, this is normal culture and that sort of thing. And Epstein was really one of the first major wake ups that there's sophisticated human trafficking occurring. There's a lot of players that want this to operate in the shadows. And then most recently with the P. Diddy case, I mean, that just kind of blew the lid and mind of what we thought of sex trafficking. So I think that as we come to a cultural reckoning, it's every pillar of society is going to be impacted by either knowingly or unknowingly looking the other way when it comes to such an important issue. And I think the public is putting enough pressure on these organizations and government to do something. And you're starting to hear the will of the people is we don't want slavery in our backyards. And that's becoming such a loud rallying call of nonprofits and for-profit technologies and coalitions that are coming together to say, not on our watch.
Yeah, it's exciting to me. Obviously, starting 15 years ago when we would talk about this, people would ask questions like, well, where are you working? We'd be like, here. And they're like, yeah, I know your organization here, but like you helping in Cambodia or like, where's the problem? Like the problem is in America. And the problem is that the news calls it underage prostitution instead of, 13-year-old kidnapping rape victim, and things like this. And it's fascinating, this progression since, we officially started in 2009 and incorporated in 2010. And it's really exciting for me because even though there's so much work left to do, there's so many smart, good people involved. And for me, like the nonprofit model kind of sucks. You can't pay people what they're worth or you get criticized. There's all these negatives with it. And for you coming at it in a for-profit method, and showing up with the money, showing up with the reputation loss, showing up, these lawsuits, it's very encouraging. Can you talk about why you've been able to get such high net worth and strong supporters like Tim Tebow as an investor?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started on the nonprofit side, and then I went to the government, and I thought, there's got to be a better way as an entrepreneur, and I didn't want to spend most of my time fundraising and barely doing any of the operations, and so that's where this idea of starting a for-profit company as first as a defense contractor and now a commercial provider came. And that was a pretty revolutionary thought. We had a lot of nonprofits that said, "Hey, what are you doing? Are you trying to make money off this issue?" And it's like, no, we want to sustain this, well beyond our lifetime. We want this to exist for a hundred years, And so that was part of the mindset shift that we had. And one of the things I often say is that if you wanted to create a reusable rocket, you would never do it with charity. You have to use the wheels of capitalism and industry to drive forward breakthrough innovation. And so that's what we're, hoping to be part of this wave. And there's guys like Tim Tebow and our venture capitalists at Eagle Venture Fund that have created a whole fund around driving the counter trafficking industry and making it harder for traffickers to operate by using risk and compliance markets as a way to help stem the tide of sex trafficking. And I think that's the only way that we're going to take an issue that impacts 50 million people and is only growing and reverse that curve is by using capitalism and innovation and fresh startups and venture capitalists that are all coming together to drive forward this new industry to solve a very hard societal problem.
So let's talk about this. Let's say there's somebody who is, a hospitality CEO or something listening today. What are they actually buying from you, and what does that do for them?
Well, the first thing that we do with our commercial partners is we take a look at their people, policies, and procedures and give them a benchmark that they can work from. So a lot of these hotels and banks, they're kind of operating under old models, oftentimes provided by charities and nonprofits, where it's just some basic training on how to spot a victim of trafficking, which is important work, but it doesn't take into account sophisticated human traffickers or organized crime, or how they might be interwoven with weapons or drugs or these other types of issues that they really should care about. And so the first is by doing this 360 look at their people, policies, and procedures, we can give kind of a baseline and gauge where they're at. So the minimum kind of involvement that a company can take, and we see this a lot in the UK because of regulation, is a pledge, a public pledge. And so in the UK, it's very common that a company will put their modern slavery pledge at the bottom of their website, publicly announce it. It's part of their board minutes and investor calls. In the US, it's very rare that you see a modern slavery pledge or a public commitment. And in fact, a lot of brands don't want their brand associated with sex trafficking, oftentimes falsely, because they believe that the public will negatively perceive the brand. But you do have a few breakout brands in the United States that specifically Southwest Airlines and others that have made fighting human trafficking part of their public commitment. And so that's where we help corporations on the very base level. Is we give them a baseline, we help them with their public pledge, we help them become more vocal about this issue, and that raises the standard of care across the market. Now, if we were to take them to the next phase, it's bringing in our technology to do cross checks against their reservation systems or the rewards programs or their account holders, and kind of weed out the worst of the worst bad actors. These human traffickers are creatures of habit, like many of us, and so they stay at the same hotel chains. They use rewards programs, and that's kind of an easy way to weed out those, at least the worst actors, from that. And the last is a full scope biannual audit that we can do on a company so that they're getting third party certified, that they're doing everything possible. And the reason that they want to do this is because they can either show up in court in front of a jury and you've got a 14-year-old that's been trafficked in their hotel, and they could say, well, how were we supposed to know? And that's what happened in this Red Roof Inn case and the Days Inn case, and they got creamed. Or they could say, hey, we're using dark watch or similar technologies, and we're at the very highest end of care of the market, and we're doing everything we possibly can to fight back against modern day slavery. So that's how we help corporations go from either looking the other way or not our problem to being proactive in their response to human trafficking.
Well, like I said, I think that's great work you're doing. Um, let's talk about another one. Right now, Child Rescue Association is fundraising for our program of teaching um, skills that like FBI counterintelligence officers use. Where it's law enforcement, but it's basically like spy skills where you're not like blackmailing an informant, do this or I'll put you in jail, but you're actually like befriending somebody in organized crime to the point where they'll say, I don't think it's my cousin's selling drugs, but it keeps me up at night. He's selling kids. I wish I could do something about that. And like this source recruitment cycle, like from the spy movies, but in a law enforcement situation. And so we were meeting with some a group that we're collaborating with on this, who's going to some big multi-million-dollar grants. And I was talking to you about that. I was talking to them about you and how we could see this as an advantage for law enforcement to have your tech tool say, hey, see these massage parlors, see these businesses. There's these type of triggers that would say this is likely controlled by organized crime, and be able to like jumpstart these law enforcement investigations. Can you share a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there's an opportunity to almost throw a dart at any workflow or process currently on this and disrupt it and make it more innovative. And I think that there's an incredible opportunity to visualize human trafficking in the way that you said, with illicit massage and these other types of derivatives of human trafficking in our backyards. And like many, I thought it was in some other country. I'd seen it, personally in India, and became very passionate about it. But I thought, oh, there's no way that it's here in America. And there's, something close to 29,000 illicit massage brothels here in the United States, where these women are promised better jobs, where they think that they're going to work in nails or a medical field. And so we were talking to one law enforcement agency, and they said, oh, this would add a lot of efficiency, because we're currently driving around to each of these places. And if we had this all visualized on a map, we wouldn't have to be driving around looking for it. And that's kind of an indicator of really the mismatch of where the crime is and where the response is. So these maps are a really powerful way. They're also a scoreboard to show how well are we doing in our efforts. Sometimes it's hard to actually measure, like, are we making an impact in this map, and visualization makes it really easy to see, yes, we are making an impact. Yes, we are driving numbers down. And we're getting the good guys are getting wins here. The next thing is the opportunity to share information. And as we know, organizations tend to be very siloed. It's very hard for them to share the proper information. And we were looking at one human trafficking case, and there was 3 separate law enforcement agencies looking at the same network, not realizing that it was a blue on blue scenario. And so tools like that can help deconflict, can show a more fuller picture of the crime landscape, and allow for smoother facilitation of response. And that's just a couple of our tools in the Eagle Freedom Fund portfolio. There's several tools that are out there that are really helpful for law enforcement. And so kind of all these tools coming together as an ecosystem is a game changer for law enforcement and community responses.
Well, I'm going to have to get those guys on the show too, so we can hear more about those and the rest of the ecosystem. Maybe I can get an intro. Um, so when you think about the future of this, AI gets thrown around like a buzzword a lot of times, but you guys are like genuinely using it. Can you talk about the AI element?
So a big part of this is that a lot of these law enforcement agencies and commercial partners are not using AI because of the sensitive nature that they're working on. And so we've built some proprietary AI and some models to help them write these very sensitive reports. And the thing that we're saying is that we don't want paperwork to be a barrier to fighting human trafficking. And right now, paperwork is a huge barrier in filing these reports and documenting it and putting the investigation in place and getting the warrants that are necessary. And so that was one of the kind of the easiest decisions as a company was let's disrupt this and make this process so much smoother. So that's just kind of one of the ways in which we're using AI. But there's a lot of other applications too, like triaging the problem, knowing where to start when everything's on fire, which fire to put out first, and that's really powerful when the AI makes meaningful connections that couldn't be made by a human, and then helps the partner understand the geography or the location or the type of crime to tackle first when they've got a desk full of cases. And so those are kind of two ways in which we're moving the needle with AI. And I think that over the next few years, there's other workflows that are going to become very apparent where we could put trusted AI in there and speed up that investigation lifecycle.
If you had advice to CEOs today who are thinking about AI and maybe their team is doing some things with it, but they feel like they're not really getting the full potential for their business, what are some principles? What are some actions? What are some questions? What are just general advice for founders or investment fund managers listening today when it comes to AI in the next couple of years for their own organization?
Something that I tell my team and have learned from other mentors is the importance of getting on the ground level with the customer. I mean, to the point that you're actually physically in the building, listening to them and asking them about their workflows. I think as entrepreneurs, and I've made this mistake plenty of times in the past that hopefully now I've learn the lesson, but it's sometimes you've got a kind of a grand vision for a problem that you're solving, but no one else shares that problem, or it's not a real workflow. And so you dump all of these resources and time, and you bring all of these technologies in, and then you try and get product market fit, and it's not there because the customers aren't asking for it, or they don't need it, or no one shares the problem. And so I think that's been one of the things that's been really transformational as an entrepreneur, and as a business leader, is that we now spend all of our time listening to our customers' workflows. Tell me about your most boring, mundane workflow that takes you an incredible amount of time to manually do. And yes, we want to hear every detail of that pain point that you have, and then we can go to the drawing board. And so I think that would be my biggest piece of advice, is to make sure that there's a product market fit on the AI and real utility for it, and not just slapping AI at the end of it. It's kind of like, we saw this with blockchain. Everything became blockchain. It's like some applications are actually better not on the blockchain. So it's the same thing with AI. There's some processes or things that AI isn't going to solve. So I think that's the big one. And then the second thing is that I've surrounded myself with a lot of people that are very wise in their domains. I'm looking for the very best when it comes to AI or product market fit, or a biography on someone that has created the blueprint for it, so I can learn from that. And I think that that's been really helpful, shortening the life cycle of going to market as an entrepreneur.
What's some example?
So you listen to some of these entrepreneurs' biographies, and Sam Walton is a good example of it. But he decided to take a very different strategy than than Kmart. Instead of going to the large metros, he went to rural America. And um, that translated strangely into our business model of starting with mid-market, mid-market rural America banks, and trying to help them embrace AI or embrace these new efficiencies. Um, and it just was really incredible, pulling from Sam Walton's strategy. So I think that there's lessons like that that you can pick up in these biographies, of the greats that have already walked it, and save yourself, 5, 10, 15 years of trying to find the answer on your own. We just aren't that smart, to be able to solve these things that take time to figure out. And so, um, those biographies have been helpful, and then real live mentors as well that are walking alongside.
Yeah, that's great. On the AI side, have you spent much time getting into creating agents yet?
So we're talking through that. We've used agents, internally. We use a lot of AI to automate our processes, and we think that those agents are very powerful as you're thinking about, a crime analyst versus a detective, or someone that has a financial crime bent versus someone that's working the streets. And but each need automation in their process. That's where agents can be really powerful, is that you're tuning it to the biography, the backstory, and the skill set of that person. And I think that there's a lot of fear that these agents are going to replace humans, and I don't think that we're there yet. I think that there's a long run where you still need the human creativity and ingenuity working in tandem, and that these agents are extensions of the really smart analysts and detectives that are out there. I just don't see an environment where we have precogs running everything like in Minority Report. So these tools can be very powerful if you can remove the fear around it and find ways to trust it. It can be transformational. It's been transformational inside the business of Dark Watch, and then also as we're thinking about these markets.
Yeah, I mean, in certain ways, I do hope they replace boring, mundane, repetitive jobs. And I mean, look, what was it, like 80+% of our population used to work on farms, making enough food for us to eat. And there's no time to invent AI when everybody's working on the farm. And the transition period can be tough. And I think society should be involved in retooling and helping people adapt to the new environment. But it's kind of like telling people we should turn off the internet, because then libraries won't be as important, and we spent a lot of money on this library like that, right? For people not familiar, can you talk about this idea of a virtual workforce and how, like, hey, this department who maybe they couldn't afford a human trafficking analyst, they just don't have the budget to add that to the force, but essentially this idea of like a dedicated AI agent where it's like a virtual human trafficking analyst that can just read everybody's reports and maybe make suggestions to the detective, and a little bit of like how that works and why that's possible now.
I mean, what a great idea. That is one of the biggest challenges in the counter trafficking movement, is the under-resourcing and underfunding of live agents to work these cases. And then they tend to be very complex, like there's a lot of shell corporations and there's a lot of players and data and information that takes a long time to physically sort through. And so an agent could speed up those connections, that are very hard to make when you're manually trying to remember what I saw on social media versus the corporate ownership of these places. And I've got the cork board and some law enforcement agencies. I mean, I was surprised. We went into one, they still had a 3-ring binder of their cases. That was their case management tool. So it's like, there's a lot of ways that these agents and the way that you're talking about could save tremendous resources and be a force multiplier, specifically in law enforcement when it comes to these types of complicated investigations.
Yeah. Can you explain to somebody how a new agent like that is coded or created?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different ways that these agents are trained up. Um, the ones that I like is where you give an agent a bit of a backstory and you explain that they graduated from this type of school and they've got this type of skill set and to assume the identity, and you season that agent with real world facts, and then you give it parameters in which it's to operate. Think as if you are, a top financial analyst for crime in all of your output and the things that I'm looking for. And so between prompts and backstory, these agents get very, very good. And so you can also think of them as kind of starting out as like a baby agent, and you have to teach it how to walk or crawl first and then walk and speak and do these sort of things. But the more that you're seasoning the agent and training the agent, the more it gets to operate on a higher level where it is solving very complex tasks and making connections and putting out information in the way that an agent in that domain would speak and think. And so that is very helpful when you season and tune an agent in that way.
What's exciting to me about that world is this idea of having multiple agents refine something before the human takes a look at it. And it's like, for marketing, you could have a copywriting agent that, proprietary knowledge database and of all your stuff, plus just, fill it full of the best copywriting advice ever written. And then like create another agent that's an editor who is trained with editor training, and like the same things you would teach a human to be an editor, you've now put into its database. And then like the one AI copywriter writes it, and then the other AI reviews it and says, let's fix this and this, that's wrong, do that. And like you can actually see them like argue back and forth almost, right?
No,
Um,
no doubt. And you think about like an all source Intel workflow. You've got an analyst that's a specialist in geospatial. You might have a human intelligence collector, a signals intelligence, a satellite, right? And if you had these agents tuned to these various intelligence collection domains and were doing rough analysis, you have the makings of all source analysis by using these agents. I had never really thought about it until you kind of phrase it in that way. And it's like now you've got a really powerful front end force that's doing basic analysis on very complex geopolitical or intel matters.
yeah, I mean, I think about it like, obviously we've supported both aftercare facilities and law enforcement organizations, and like you talk about under-resourced. I mean, they're generally under-resourced, right? And defund the police didn't do anything to help save more kids in this country.
Right.
And you imagine them having an AI where they've got like another human trafficking investigator, detective agent AI. Then they've got a DA, district attorney, or wherever the prosecutor is going to be from, AI. And then they've got a judge AI that's like, it's been preloaded with all of the criminal cases in our state or our, pick the jurisdiction it's going to be tried at. And like, if that detective could be like taking information, having the other detective say possible next steps, having the DA agent weigh in on how that's going to make their case prosecutable or not, have the judge weigh in on like what are the typical judges in this state going to say about a prosecutor saying something like that, and like being able to run all this up front and then go back and get more evidence.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of the Kraft case, and part of the reason that it collapsed on the Vine was an improper writing of the paperwork to get the wire, and the wire so it's like that's where writing for a wire or a warrant or teeing up the front end of an investigation there shouldn't be any errors, and you could use these tools to make sure that it's catching errors or identifying errors, so that you're giving the case its best possible shot when you go after it.
For people not familiar with that case, can you give us the background?
Yeah, so there was a major alleged human trafficking bust in South Florida, where Robert Kraft was there in the facility. Um, this bust, they had found that they believe that the women were actually living in the facility, cooking over pots in the back parking lot, and as often the case with labor trafficking into illicit massage, and so this was illicit massage. There's oftentimes heavy cash flow and connections out, and so this case uh, didn't go to completion, and because of that, there are a lot of districts that don't want to do an illicit massage brothel case. So there's other ways of looking at it as labor trafficking or financial crime case or other ways that become interesting to district attorneys. But yeah, it was kind of unfortunate that there was that case didn't go all the way.
For people who don't know, will you tell us who Robert Kraft is and what it was specifically that had fall apart with the wire?
Yeah, so I'm not sure all of the specifics around the wire, but Robert Kraft was the owner of the New England Patriots, and so a very high profile figure. And we've seen a few high profile figures wrapped up in these illicit massage brothel things. There was another famous case out of DC where it was all these defense contractors and people with high clearances that were wrapped up in a very sophisticated illicit massage ring in DC, and so we're starting to see more of that. And that's what I was talking about earlier, is that we're kind of facing a societal reckoning of the stuff that was done in the shadows or right under our nose coming into full light, in the public responding in a very visceral way.
Um, it is interesting with let's go back to Jeffrey Epstein and the problems for JP Morgan and other organizations that had stuff to do with him. Can you talk more about just the attitudes and like when these large customers are buying your services and AI to help preserve their reputation and keep them from lawsuits worth hundreds of millions? What are these conversations? What are they saying to you when they're buying this or starting to use your services?
Well, I'll tell you what they said 2 years ago, and now what they're saying. So there was an online social media platform, and let's just say that we said we've got this sex trafficking data that we think overlaps with things that you care about, and they said it was a dating platform. They said that prostitutes need love too, was their response 2 years ago. And so uh, we then entered into an NDA after all these lawsuits, and now can help organizations like that. But there was a lot of conversations where I had with executives that said, "Oh, we would never be liable for that," and I think that we're seeing, who would have ever thought that Abercrombie and Fitch would be liable for sex trafficking? I mean, it's just not even remotely on the radar, but they are, and that's part of a cultural shift, that there should be a public pledge and there should be some corporate action that's taken, especially if the industry is one of the 30 industries that traffickers use as part of their logistics. So you think, transportation and hospitality and banking, all of these are channels where traffickers are moving their product from point A to point B. And all of those have really a duty in the line of that to try and stop it. But now the conversation has switched to these corporations proactively reaching out and saying, "Hey, we need help. We want to do the right thing." There's more corporations that their CEOs or new CEOs that have just come in that have been exposed to this that are saying, "Hey, before anything happens, I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure that this is not happening in our business. Where do we start?" Um, and we're getting a lot of conversations like that where corporations do want to do the right thing um, and be perceived in the right light. So that's obviously been very, very helpful to us. It's kept our calendar incredibly busy. But we're excited to see that shift in the market. And it is a real pivotal stance, probably in the last 2 quarters, on how corporate leadership sees this issue.
Um, it's encouraging to hear that things are getting better. I think that response really frustrates me, where we have, my mother-in-law and her mom and generations of my wife family. I want to like, I want to like take that to the New York Times and say, we're talking about one adult renting out a kid to be
Yep.
abused by another adult for money. And this is the response. Like, for starters, that is like literally not prostitution.
Right.
When one adult forcibly rents out someone else. Um, that really boils my blood. I'm not going to lie. So I think I commend you on your restraint to work with them, and now they become a client and you didn't make an enemy out of them. But that would have been a temptation for me to make an example of them so just to clarify, you want to protect adults who are abusing kids for money. That's the corporate position you're taking. That's a tough one.
Yeah, I heard this stat, and you have to take it as possibly misinformation or an anecdotal story. But someone that was working high up at at a hotel chain and or working with these hotel chains to book corporate travel, and they said that these lower kind of like motels and mid range, up to 30% was used of their occupancy was used for what they labeled escorting, which, as we know, often overlaps with sex trafficking. And so that, whether that's true or not, you can start to understand why there's corporate pushback, because it's like, oh, these are our occupancy rates, or one that we've seen with social media companies is they don't want to weed out all the bad actors, because then they show a sharp decline in user count when they present to the board. And there's several online gaming platforms that have just been really terrible in their response to trust and safety. One of these platforms, Roblox, there was actually a kidnapping that occurred through Roblox. And so part of the other piece of this equation is for the corporations that are not responding, is working with parents and communities to equip them how to keep their kids safe on these platforms and know the inherent risks. Because I think that there's a lot of parents that don't understand in-game chats or how these gaming platforms or social media platforms are being used either by organized crime or predators and exploiters. And so, for me, this story started as a child and my sister being almost nearly kidnapped in real life. But the battleground.
Yeah, where was that, and how old were you, and how old was she?
Yeah, so she was 4 years old at the time, and I was about 9. This was in an indoor market in South Florida, and this lady distracts my dad, kind of complimenting his shirt, which was just a plain polo shirt at the time. And then when he looked down, he saw that my sister was gone. He trusts his instincts, which I believe was, the Lord giving him guidance on this, and runs towards the exit of this building. Man we didn't know was walking out the door with my sister, and my dad recovers her at the very last second. And so that was our risk. And of course, that's still a risk in any time. But when the predators and exploiters know that they can go directly into the home via these applications, that's the new battlefront. You know, it was stranger danger as we were kids, but now it's hardcore organized crime out of you know, all parts of certain parts of Africa and certain parts of Europe that are sextorting these kids through these platforms.
Yeah, it's tough. You know, our charity supported a group down in Central America who was working with the intelligence division of their national police, and the traffickers sold them the kids over Facebook, and we're sending the pictures over Facebook. You know, do you want these kids? And luckily, it's a success story where the police were able to catch traffickers and free the kids. But you just think about how many times that's happening when it wasn't law enforcement involved, right?
Right? Exactly.
Well, if people want to learn more, will you give us the website, and is LinkedIn the best place to follow you, or where online?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can go to darkwatch.io and then Noel Thomas with Darkwatch on LinkedIn to gain more information. We're constantly putting out training and information through the LinkedIn and our website. We've got a pretty incredible blog that talks about trafficking, how corporations can stay safe. And so darkwatch.io or LinkedIn would be the best channels.
That's great. What about you know, there's so many parts of this that can be so depressing, and yet there's some parts that can be so inspirational. I mean, I think about like the percentage of Americans that care about this problem since we started 15 years ago is like night and day. I mean, we started before the movie Taken came out, before there's all these other organizations. I mean, it is, with so much work to do, it is so wildly incredible that I get to meet people like you. And there's so many people like taking up the sword and getting in the fight to protect these kids. You look at statistically across the world as a percentage of the population, we now have the lowest population of slavery in history. And even though the number is a big number, as a percentage, we're actually winning. And, you know, it's like poverty. I mean, we do not talk about over 1 billion people being brought out of poverty over the last number of decades. And like, as a world, we are winning the war on slavery. We just need to like take it right to the end. We can't slow down now. In fact, we need to speed up now that we have so much momentum. What's something that makes you optimistic about this issue?
Well, I have to take an opportunity to talk a little bit about my faith, and that being a huge driver for why I'm here. And it also has forced me to kind of go to the edge of my own thinking about this issue. So I was traveling in an internationally touring rock and roll band. I'm in Iceland. I meet this this trafficker that came to the Christian faith, and he used his house of slavery and prostitution, turned that into an addiction recovery center, and later entered into the ministry. And I really wrestled with this thought because I've got a strong sense of justice. You know, I want to see justice for all those that are enslaved, and for us to use every mechanism of law enforcement and the full weight of the rule of law to crack down. And here I am standing, you know, with someone that I literally fight against all day, every day, and seeing this. And that was kind of a wake-up call. It doesn't negate the need for the rule of law or the weight of justice. But I personally believe, and this is my belief, that Jesus can change the hardest of hearts, and someone can come to know him in a very real way, and that totally transform their life. And so, you know, whether people agree with that or not is okay. But the one thing that I think is really unique is that this is a war for hearts and minds too, and we need to change public perception on this issue, that this is happening in our backyards. This is a real issue. We all have a hand to play in fighting this, and that we can see hope, and that we can see a difference made in this issue, and toy with the question: is anyone truly beyond redemption? And so, for me, that faith has been a huge driver in the mission. It gives me hope for a future, and I love that this issue is a unifier, because it doesn't matter what your faith is or which side of the aisle you're on. We should all be able to agree as a human race that slavery is a bad thing. And that message is cool when you start to see groups come together and become unified over something that I think is the most pressing issue of our lifetime.
Well, I echo that. I'm a pretty churchy guy myself, and I believe what you just said. And what's funny is that group in Central America that I talked about us supporting, the individual who leads that was very heavily involved in organized crime, and it made him so unhappy that he decided to commit suicide, and it didn't work, and so he ended up changing his life, and now has helped hundreds of kids across multiple countries and become such a force for good. And for people who aren't churchy, one of my favorite guys is Warren Duffy. He was the first guy to start doing prison reform, of like teaching teaching inmates new job skills, so when they got out, they didn't have to go back to crime. And just got criticized by like crazy, and the journalists were ripping them apart, and people just wanted those people to be punished. They weren't really thinking about the future of society, like actually making a better society. So they thought, no, these are bad people. We can't be helping them. They need to feel the pain, right? And so people said to him, like, don't you know leopards can't change their spots? And he shot back, don't you know I don't work with leopards? I work with men, and men change every day.
I love that. That is really cool. That's very powerful. And I think that we have to hold on to hope. We aren't meant for despair. And like you said, as a percentage, slavery is at an all-time low, and we are starting to see venture capital and innovation and all these things start to come together, and we are seeing, what I would consider miracles happening, and even the hardest hearts changing, with that story that you talked about. And so I think that's awesome. And the last piece is that everyone, kind of no matter what their background, I never saw my life kind of taking this turn towards AI and running a tech company when I was in a rock and roll band, over 15 years ago. But really, any platform can be an opportunity to fight back against this, even if it's just having a conversation in your household or with your local community or town council. I mean, really, everyone can be a modern day abolitionist.
Well, I love it. Thanks for making time to do this.
Yes, thank you for having me on the show. This was awesome.
You bet. Okay, bye everyone.